The 6th of March, 1944, Berlin, Germany, 30,000 feet, and the sky is hard glass. A swarm of Focke-Wulfs tips in from sunward, the old confident roll that once opened bomber boxes like a can. A leader steadies his sight for the familiar head-on rake breath, even inside the mask, counting the half seconds to fire. Then white sparks walk across his canopy from nowhere. A silver shape hangs on his high six, too close to be decent, 8 half-inch guns, stitching a zipper from wing root to spine. Oil bursts across the windscreen. The engine coughs sideways. The horizon tilts, not fast, not violent, just a slow, undeniable slide, and his gloved hand finds nothing on the throttle that will make the drag of that American vanish. Inside a B-17 500 yards astern, the top turret gunner flinches for the expected head-on scythe that never comes. Instead, he hears the dry, measured ripping of distant 50 seconds and a flat voice on the interphone. Fighter cover engaged. Hold course. Oxygen pops like fingers tapping glass. The ship shivers once and settles still in the box, contrails knitting straight ahead toward the city that used to live behind a curtain none of their escorts could lift. 2,000 meters off the beam. A Bf-109 tries the second act, written by a year of habit, climb, float, roll, slash the egress lane. He checks his mirror out of reflex and finds a speck he expects to fall away at the edge of Germany. The speck grows. He shoves the throttle and waits for the old mercy of distance. It does not arrive. The American stays welded to the arc, slides a fraction low, and cuts a diagonal of fire from radiator to cockpit. The 109 holds level for the length of a breath, and then unfolds like paper in rain, black scraps kissing the contrail before they vanish. A third German, cool and correct, dives for a straggler. The Mustang that killed the 109 does not climb to meet him. It rolls inverted, lets gravity do the aiming, and rakes through the exit the German counted on. One hit takes the tailplane. The fighter flies straight on momentum and then begins a slow, humiliating corkscrew toward fields dusted white beyond the city. For 3 seconds, there is only the private noise of flight. Wind over canopies, a pilot's pulse, loud in the ears, the sharp breath of men, working masks, a faint ticking in the fuselage where hot metal cools. A gun camera whirs. A wing bears a thin smear of oil. No one says a brave thing. The bomber stream does not bend. It goes on, square after square, right over the roofs that were supposed to be protected by distance and arithmetic. The radio, crowded a moment ago, with confident jokes, thins to hiss. Somewhere below, a cratered runway waits for returns that will not come. Above, the contrails draw clean lines east, and then unhurried they keep going. By March 1944, the war in the air turns on distance and habit. Distance once protected the capital. Habit told German pilots that the far end of Europe would thin the escorts until only bombers remained. The calendar says winter is almost spent, fuel coupons say otherwise. Yet the conviction survives on airfields from Jüterbog to Werneuchen that daylight raiders cannot carry fighters all the way to Berlin and back with enough breath left to fight. That belief is not propaganda. It is earned from a year of practice in which formations died on the long leg home and the radio over central Germany felt like private sky. It is also a belief about time. Keep the days expensive for the Americans, and spring will deliver a pause, a bargain, or at least a narrower doorstep to defend. Across the channel, the ledger is different but just as stark. Factory lines in Kansas and California push engines and airframes like grain. The bomber groups know the math of grief by heart. Schweinfurt and Regensburg live in every briefing room as a seam of silence when the map cursor reaches deep Germany. The counters on the table are measured in minutes of range and ounces of fuel. The words are plain: get there, stay there, get back. The new shape on the map is a silver fighter that can cruise high without panting and still carry a fight after it drops the paper skins from its wings. That shape is important not because it is perfect, but because it removes the single most dependable ally the Luftwaffe has left: distance. The ground war tightens the screw without mercy. In Italy, the line crawls north through stone and mud. In the east, whole armies grind around cities that exist now as names. In the west, an invasion timetable is no longer a rumor. The job of the daylight offensive is simple, on paper and murderous in practice: tear rail hubs, oil ball bearings, and aircraft production until the defenses above the beaches become brittle. Everything depends on clock speed. If the Luftwaffe can still make the deep end, fatal tempo slows. If the deep end becomes just another altitude block inside escort reach, tempo climbs until steel breaks. German fighter wings enter March with pride and muscle memory. Aces who survive the long year of head-on passes carry the authority of proof. Ground controllers know the bomber routes. The climb points the places where a stream bunches and bleeds. Fuel shortages, force short climbs, and single decisive passes. That constraint turned into craft became doctrine. Go in fast from the sunfire, once through the boxes break out before turret arcs and P-47 seconds bite. If a fort drifts, collect it on the second act. The pattern worked often enough to feel like physics. Berlin sat behind that pattern like a colossus that did not need to swing. It only needed to stand and let arithmetic do the killing. On the American side, a quiet change has already happened. The escort brief does not sound like a leash anymore. The directive is outward-facing, meet the intercept before it becomes a wall. That means fuel planning that borders on arrogance and the acceptance that some fighters will not make it back with pretty gauges. It also means trusting that factories and training units can absorb the cost of aggressive choices. A single lost German ace damages more than metal. A single lost American section is expensive and survivable. That asymmetry is not a boast. It is the cold foundation of a plan to make the far end of Germany contested every hour a bomber needs it to be. The men who will execute this plan are tired in different ways. German pilots are tired of rationed time in the air, tired of short climbs that end in a single gulp of violence, tired of watching fuel trucks cough fumes. American crews are tired of funerals and of the knowledge that the sky can turn into a math problem you cannot solve. Both sides carry superstition like a second set of dog tags. One superstition says, escorts vanish beyond a certain longitude. The other says the deep missions always take somebody you know. March will test both. The choice set for each command is narrow. Germany can protect its remaining strength by husbanding aircraft and pilots, keeping interceptions inside fuel-safe envelopes, and striking where the odds are best. That conserves, but conservation yields the sky inch by inch. America can press hardest where the enemy thought distance would keep him safe, but that requires the escorts to arrive with energy in hand and to remain after the first pass. It requires a willingness to let fighters roam ahead of the bombers and risk the old terror separation on purpose. If it works, the interceptor's climb is spoiled before it begins. If it fails, the stream meets the old teeth without even the comfort of a close escort ring. This is why the first Berlin mission matters beyond its wreckage tally. It is a proof or a warning, and either result will echo into the ground war that is coming. If German pilots find clear lanes between escort cycles, the old cadence returns one clean slash, a handful of burning heavies, a climb back to fields that still belong to them. If instead, they discover silver fighters waiting over their own cities, and still there on the egress, the day becomes long, and the calculus of who can afford to press begins to change. Inside that calculus hide the human stakes that numbers conceal. A young German wingman, who has only ever trained in short bites of flight, will meet an enemy fresh at an altitude where he expected to rest. An American bomber crew who once felt the horizon turn hostile past Magdeburg will hold formation with a sliver, less fear in the throat. Neither side becomes invincible. Both sides lose men. What shifts is the direction of gravity in every engagement. Momentum that used to pull toward German exits now tugs the other way. There is a political clock under the cloud sheet. If daylight raids stumble at the capital, the argument for delay gains breath in Berlin, and in places where negotiations are still spoken of as if they are more than smoke. If raids keep time over the capital with fighters still striking on the outleg, the argument shrinks to the size of a fuel drum. Ground commanders, counting barges and beach obstacles, need the second outcome. Fighter groups and bomber groups who have learned to speak to one another through escorts and signals and the quiet exchange of risk are the hinge. So, the moment over Berlin is not a flourish. It is a door test. The hand on the latch is the P-51's range and the discipline of how it is used. The resistance is a year's worth of German instincts, reinforced by success and constrained by scarcity. If the door opens on the first, push habits on both sides must change fast. German units will shorten their leash to survive. American escorts will get bolder about sweeping ahead and lingering on the way out. If the door holds, then the West will keep paying for distance with aluminum and blood until the beaches are under a different sky. The cord is drawn tight from the North Sea to the capital. Pull one way, and the old pattern holds private German sky. At the far end, escorts fading where it matters, bombers punished for audacity. Pull the other, and the far end becomes just another working altitude noisy with Mustangs where laughter on the radio dies into checklists. The first pass on March 6 does not decide a war. It decides which way the cord will sing when it is plucked. The machines that terrorize skies and streets did so because their physics fit a brutal math to close the time a target is exposed, and you reduce survival to a single clean action. German fighters and heavy flak achieved kill rates not by mystery but by geometry and timing. A head-on pass against a bomber stream compresses exposure to seconds. A short, hard run through the nose denies turret arcs time to converge. In towns, a heavy tank's frontal plate translated seconds into safety. You could posture, pick a lane, and the numbers favored you until someone held a sight steady on a different axis. That is the language of survival. It reduces hardware to questions a crew can feel in their hands. Where will I see the first steady sight? How long does it take to get that sight? What happens to me in the 3 seconds after I see it? Convert technical specs into those 3 seconds, and you stop reading manuals and start reading lives. German aircraft retained real practical advantages that had earned their reputation. The few 190's acceleration out of a dive and the Bf 109G's climb rate meant they could choose the point of contact. They could initiate with energy and try to break away before escorts could commit. Their cannon armament could sever critical systems, the cockpit frame, a coolant line, a control cable, so a single good pass could create an unrecoverable cascade of failures. Ground-based defenses were often laid against long legs and massed formations. Flak belts over target areas forced predictable vertical profiles that German fighters exploited. For crews on both sides, these were not abstractions. They were a map of where you could breathe and where you could not. The counter is simple in concept and exacting in execution. Deny the enemy the steady sight that allows a clean kill. That denial can come from reach arrive, over the contested airspace with energy and position, or from the way you take the shot, a short, disciplined burst at a precise sight picture that removes the opponent's systems in the handful of heartbeats that define life or death at altitude. The P-51's value was not only that it could fly a long leg, it was that it preserved the pilot's ability to stabilize a sight picture at altitude and deliver that 3-second decision with consistency. The Packard-built Merlin breathed at high altitude. The Mustang's airframe held aim steady under conditions that made other fighters fidget. In a fight where the first steady sight wins, that steadiness is lethal. Mechanically, lethality is almost always a cascade. A tracer line through a radiator first starves an engine of coolant. The temperature spikes, bearings seize vibration, amplifies controls, stiffen, and the airplane stops answering the stick in a way that feels like someone else taking a hand on the control column. A properly placed burst that shears a tailplane cable makes flying an arithmetic problem. Without that cable, trim changes require control forces the pilot cannot hold. The 50 caliber packs energy that, when synchronized and harmonized across a wing, does not need a cinematic miracle. It needs discipline. Harmonize sights so that a 3 to 5 second burst at standard deflection produces predictable system failures instead of scatter. Teach pilots to take the sight at a distance that trades just enough closure for certainty. That trade-off is the core of the Mustang tactic. Choose the angle and the timing so the burst achieves mechanical cascade rather than cosmetic holes. Tactics followed from machine behavior. The Luftwaffe's doctrine relied on initiating contact close enough to the bombers to exploit the confusion in the stream, but far enough that escorts had to make a decision, turn inside the fighters and risk a turning fight, or stay with the intent. Heavies and cede the kill. American doctrine reshaped that choice by converting escort into hunter. Rather than cling to the bomber and react, Mustang units planned to meet the intercept before it could form, to force the Germans into a problem they had not chosen to fight at a disposition where the Mustang held the energy, and thus the people, choice of engagement. That doctrinal shift demanded new praxis fuel calculations, jettison discipline, rendezvous geometry, so that pilots arrived with both altitude and reserve to fight and then return. In the small space between sighting and impact, the human scale dominates. There is a feel to the sight picture that jibes with survival, a steady ring, a true lead, a line of horizon that will not break under G. At 200 meters, the first steady sight wins in about 3 seconds. At 600 meters, the fight can widen into a mess where discipline or luck decides. Crews learn to prize the first steady sight because everything following it is triage control, power management, and procedure. The man-to-machine translation also demanded new standard operating behavior. Burst discipline was taught as if it were a survival ritual, not long bleed-out streams that wasted ammunition and blurred the aim, but sharp, calibrated bursts, timed to damage the systems that mattered. Wingmen trained to present angles that fixed the adversary's escape vector, reducing the possibility that a clever roll or split would invert the geometry. Fighters learned not to brawl in a box of long turns where German climb rates and roll authority could be decisive, but to fight with energy management, keep speed, pick angles, and make your shots count. Repeated engagements mattered more than single spectacular kills because repeatability proved doctrine rather than luck. Another intercept in the same corridor, where escorts arrived with energy and maintained presence, would confirm the first event as a pattern. That pattern created a new tactical arithmetic. If you can expect sustained presence from escorts at the far end, then your preconception of safe egress collapses. The enemy's habit of staging clean slashes becomes a liability when the defender refuses to vanish after the pass. On the sea, the same mechanics applied under different names. Hedgehog changes the timing of depth warfare. Instead of waiting for a U-boat to bob into a death zone behind the ship, the ahead-throwing pattern interposes a lethal volume in front of the contact, converting the assassin's stealth into a trap. In practice, the Hedgehog's volley does not need a single massive hit to win. It needs to deny the U-boat time to correct depth or angle to force it into a control mistake. The crew feels that denial as a knock on the hull, a pressure change that turns the silent world into a place where oxygen and compression become urgent. The human consequence is identical whether in cockpits or in hulls. Systems fail in a sequence. First, the instrument readout blurs. Then the control response lags. Then a smell, hot oil burning insulation, becomes the final proof that nothing will be the same in a minute. Training that treats the machine as a stack of cascading failure modes. What breaks first? What follows how long? Before control is lost, turns design specs into survival procedures. That is the difference between a weapon that is good on paper and one that lives in combat. Finally, repeatability separates a moment from a myth. If the same geometry produces the same cascade across multiple encounters, you can codify the response, build procedure around it, and make survival statistical rather than mystical. When escorts could reliably appear over formerly sacred airspace and hold the sight picture long enough to deliver the 3 seconds that decide life, the mechanics of German advantage were neutralized, not by one heroic act, but by an acticity, engineered repeatable counter-sight timing discipline. The machine kept its edges, but the arithmetic that once protected the far end no longer summed in the same favor. He straps in with hands that know the order without thinking. Battery magnetos prime start. The Focke-Wulf coughs into life, and the needle quivers, where it always does when fuel clerks have counted liters like coins. The canopy slides shut with a sound that belongs to winter. Frost on the field edges ruts hard as bone, wheels up. He takes the first turn, climbing into a sky that is thin and grainy. The controller's voice is clipped numbers and headings, no adjectives. He repeats them because repetition is a kind of armor. The bomber stream should be a gray seam ahead and slightly left, and the old method should still fit sun on the shoulder. One clean pass through the noses, a break before turret arcs, stitch the cockpit, a climb toward home with engine temps in, the safe band. He flexes his right foot and feels the familiar pressure in the ankle where a long-ago landing ran out of runway. It is the only private thought he allows. The first sight of the Americans is not the bombers. It is a glint that does not belong at this distance, a speck high that refuses to fade when he tells himself it will. He delays worry the way he has been trained to delay firing count to the right number. The speck holds. He rolls into the attack anyway, because habit has mass, and habits have kept him alive when fuel did not. The nose settles. The sight ring swallows a square shape. The motor is clean. The slip ball is quiet. He breathes out to steady the shot, and in the corner of his eye the glint becomes a line. He tells himself it is only a sunlit turret. The first stitch of impacts arrives like hail across the wing route before his finger can tighten. The engine note turns granular. Oil rips across the screen, warm and sour in the mask. He holds the dive a heartbeat longer to make the pass count. One burst will still do work even blind, but the horizon smears. A hand he cannot see pushes the tail. He rolls level, and the airplane rolls back of its own will. The radio is crowded, and then it is not. There is a short, clean silence where jokes used to live. He presses the transmit key and says he is hit, which is not a request and not a complaint, only a fact for the controller's map. The voice that replies belongs to someone who is moving counters on a board and cannot see the oil on his boots. Across the seam of contrail, a Mustang driver steps through a rhythm he has said out loud so often it now plays without words. Tanks checked, tanks gone, mixture leaned for height, prop set. He holds the sun off the left shoulder because experience says the next pair will try to float through the glare. He does not chase the first target past the moment the burst lands. He lets it fall out of the frame as if it were never the point. The point is the second contact forming a shallow S-turn just outside the bomber boxes. He moves the nose with 2 fingers and watches the sight grow unhurried. The airplane does not fidget. He is not proud of that. He is grateful. There is a habit on the other frequency as strong as any in his own. The German wingman checks his mirror, sees the speck, and waits for mercy that has always come at the edge of range. He has a handful of hours in this airframe since winter tightened. He knows how to climb, how to turn, how to conserve. He does not yet know how it feels when conservation meets someone who does not tire. The Mustang slides a fraction low to make the angle honest, and the burst is the length of a breath. No fireworks, no drama. Radiator first, then pilot. The 109 holds level a moment, as if it has decided to continue by force of character. It does not. A strip of metal lifts from the tail and drifts away like ash. The bomber, that was supposed to be a victim, rides on rails it cannot see. Inside the top turret, gunner tastes oxygen dry as Winter hears the distinct tone of a 50 at distance and tells himself not to swing for shadows. He has learned to trust the escorts without looking for them, in the same way he has learned to trust the tiny movements of his own ship as it breathes under load. The interphone carries a flat voice from the cockpit that might be reciting a grocery list. Course steady. Altitude steady. Time to target as briefed. He watches a silver wing arc past and feels relief as a physical weight in his shoulders, and then just as quickly, the need to keep the left and right arcs honest returns. Relief is a luxury that burns like fuel. The German who survived the first burst drags the Focke-Wulf into a shallow turn and buys himself seconds that feel expensive. The oil makes the canopy into a bad mirror. He cracks it for air, and the Winter hardens his teeth. The airplane will land if he can see a field, and he will live if the field has a length that favors mercy. He glances at the fuel gauge by instinct, and hates the instinct. The needle is a joke. He trims nose up and prays not to stall. It is not the enemy that frightens him now. It is the small mistakes that follow damage like wolves. A touch too much rudder, a notch of flap too soon, the way a wing drops when a gust meets a scar. The Mustang pilot calls one smoking with no pleasure in it and slides into a weave that anticipates the next threat rather than celebrates the last shot. He is not alone. His wingman holds a high cover pattern that looks casual and is not. They speak in fragments and numbers, because fragments and numbers travel faster than feelings. The group frequency hums with the same plain words repeated in different voices. He returns to the bomber track for a moment and checks spacing the way a machinist checks tolerances. Then he is off again, a shallow dive that brings him level with a pair, building an approach from the wrong quarter. They see him early enough to brake, but not early enough to make the break elegant. It takes a decision. He respects they leave the pass unmade. He does not follow. The egress leg is long, and he does not feed luck. On the ground later, the German will write the report that turns an afternoon into lines of text. The report will say, escort, persistent over target, and multiple engagements on egress. It will not say that he felt old for the first time, staring through oil and winter at a field that might not be long enough. He will remember the way the airplane bucked when the tail caught a ripple, and how quiet the engine became when it had nothing left to say. The crew chief will pull the cowl and stare at damage that speaks a dialect he can read. Coolant, gone bearings, hot a smear where a shaft used to be straight, and the chief will understand that no careful maintenance can give back the fuel that was never there to train a replacement for the man who limped home. The American will sign his form with numbers that fit into a ledger. Ammo, expended fuel, remaining time over target contacts, claimed with the shrinking language of probability. He will hand over a film can that shows a line of light walking into an engine bay and then the sudden steadiness of a dead airplane. He will say he felt good metal under him and that the map points were as briefed. He will not say that there was a second during the roll-in when he thought about the bomber gunner's voice last month, reading letters with hands that shook. He does not frame his work that way. He frames it in checklists, because checklists keep men alive, and because any other frame would place him inside a story that steals attention from the next pass. There is a moment on the egress when the sky becomes spare. Contrails thin, the city's smudge falls behind, and the radio noise drops to the bone. The Mustang rides a line that navigators drew the night before under a lamp that smelled of hot dust. He checks fuel again, and trusts the pencil math. He tests the trim the way a bassist checks tuning without thinking about it. The engine's tone is a companion he will miss someday, and he knows it. He keeps the thought small. On the other side of the air, a band of Germans in clean machines waits at an altitude, chosen by the fuel truck, and by a staff officer who does not have enough pilots to gamble. They will look up and see silver specks returning with energy in hand, and they will choose not to climb. The choice will feel like prudence. It will also feel like defeat, and the two feelings will be hard to separate. Back at dispersal, the German finishes the landing with a roll that wobbles twice and corrects as if by will. The canopy bangs open, cold floods in, and he sits for a breath too long, because standing would make the hands show what the face will not. The crew truck arrives with its familiar stink of fuel. Someone helps him down, and the airplane ticks as it cools. He looks at the wing and sees the neat drill of holes that made the day what it was. He feels anger at the waste of good metal, then shame at the anger, then nothing at all. Back at his own field, the American steps down into mud that remembers other boots. He gives the crew chief a list that sounds like grocery items: rough mag on climb, slight vibration above 30, oil smear port leading edge, and the chief grunts and writes, because a list like that is a promise that tomorrow will look like today. The pilot walks to debrief with a film can that smells faintly of oil and old felt. He will sit in a room where maps still hum with static, and he will talk about altitudes and headings. When someone asks what it felt like over Berlin, he will say, the air was cold, and the sun was bad in the eyes, and the bandits were present, and the job was done. Then he will drink coffee that has been burning on a hot plate too long, and he will stare at a clock that keeps perfect time for men who will not. When night comes, each man measures it by different sounds. One hears trucks grinding on frozen ruts, and the distant cough of a generator, and a door that will not close tight. The other hears wind walking the canvas of a tent, and boots thumping boards, and a typewriter eating paper. Both sleep the same way soldiers sleep, like a switch thrown, until a voice wakes them, and the order of the morning repeats. In the repetition is safety, and in the safety is the next meeting, above a city that no longer belongs to habit. The change begins with a sentence that alters the work a fighter does. Escorts are no longer a fence, they are a knife. Briefings replace stay close with go forward, not as flourish, but as procedure. The risk is clear. Step away from the bomber stream, and the old terror returns: separation, empty sky, when guns are needed. The confidence to take that risk rests on arithmetic made on factory floors and in fuel ledgers, not in slogans. Range is bought in tin and time. Light, thin-walled tanks are pressed by the 100,000 and stacked like bread. A pilot can bolt two to the wings, climb through winter air, and cross a line on the map that used to be a wall. The tanks are ugly. They sweat and dent. They are perfect because they do not matter after the first engagement. Punch them off, and the fighter remains clean, with enough fuel inside to fight and to go home. That disposable reach changes every table in the operations room. Planners no longer chart a vanishing escort arc. They schedule presence on the inbound over the target on the outbound. Engines are the second leg of the decision. A Packard-built Merlin that breathes thin air and holds power where other motors fade is not a romance. It is a contract. Hold top speed and climb at altitude without burning the last third of the tanks. Keep a steady sight picture when the airframe wants to quiver. Accept the dive without tearing the nose off. When commanders bet on forward sweeps, they are betting that engines and airframes will keep the knife sharp for the minutes that matter, not just reach the place where the fight begins. Doctrine follows hardware because hardware has made certain choices survivable. The escort groups are told to meet the intercept ahead of the bombers to break up climbs while they are still lines on a German controller's board. That demands rehearsed fuel discipline. A pilot has to know exactly when the outside tanks die, exactly when to switch, exactly how much internal fuel he wants to spend before he sees contrails over the capital. Sloppiness makes gliders. Precision makes hunters. Squadrons train to jettison in pairs so that both fighters arrive in the same weight and drag state. They standardize burst lengths so ammunition counts across the formation stay inside a predictable envelope. These are small acts that add up to the permission to fight far from the heavies without stranding them. The communications net is rewired to carry the new shape of work. Instead of a constant defensive murmur around the bomber, stacked blocks of air are assigned for free hunts and rejoins. Controllers learn to think in depth, not in rings. When a German wing leaves the runway, the escorts are already stacked in altitude slices, each slice owning a task: spoil the climb, cut the merge, sit on the egress. The language is bare, because bare words travel fast. Reports after the mission capture headings: altitudes, burst, counts, ammunition left on touchdown. Debriefers strip out adjectives and keep only what can be used tomorrow at 0700. Standard operating behavior spreads by repetition. One group tests a weave that preserves energy better in the cold sky over the Elbe. 2 days later, it appears in another group's briefing. Gun harmonization patterns that yield a cleaner system, kill at 200 meters, become the default without a memo. A trick for keeping sun off the left shoulder during the run-in becomes ritual. When a wing discovers that keeping a small reserve of internal fuel for a climb gate on the outbound saves bombers from late slashes, that reserve becomes sacred. The culture of the escort changes from protectors to interrupters, and then to something colder: managers of the enemy's climb. The factories and depots make this evolution safe enough to be doctrine. A lost fighter is a form of phone call to supply a line item that hurts but does not cripple. The training pipeline is long and loud. Replacement pilots arrive with hours in type, not promises to make hours later. Maintenance crews can pull a cowling swap, a power plant, and return a machine to the line faster than winter can erode confidence. These mundane truths are what allow the briefers to say forward without lying. The whole system is built to absorb the losses that offensive escort will demand. Across the line, the arithmetic runs the other way. Fuel is a calendar. Synthetic plants draw bombs. Transport to airfields that once felt safe now passes under skies where silver fighters idle. Training hours shrink until a new pilot knows how to climb and turn and not much else. An ace is more than a man. He is a store of hard-earned minutes that cannot be replaced when his machine breaks on a bad day. Doctrine bends around scarcity. Intercepts are planned to fit inside short fuel arcs. Head-on passes are rationed to the best opportunities. Long chases are a luxury. When ground control sees a bomber stream with strong escort, the order to break away may come not from caution, but from necessity, because there is no second section to hand the fight to, and no reserve to cover the egress if the first try. A's. German units disperse to protect against the afternoon visits that have become routine. That dispersal costs readiness. Maintenance spreads thin across satellite strips. Parts chase airframes instead of waiting for them. Crews spend minutes they cannot spare, towing and warming and repositioning. The system begins to curate, rather than to risk. Beautiful machines and dangerous men are husbanded because they are irreplaceable. Curation is rational. It is also a confession that initiative has become unaffordable. Commanders on both sides make decisions that reveal how they think time works. American leadership takes the short-term hit: more fuel forward, more engines consumed, higher accident rates from aggressive flying, in exchange for a longer-term gain, break the habit that made the deep end fatal. German leadership tries to stretch assets across too many demands: defend factories, protect cities, cover training, preserve cadres for a future that keeps receding. When a staff officer refuses a tempting engagement to save fuel for tomorrow, he may be correct. He is also writing a sentence that reads, "The enemy can keep doing this." Paperwork shows the transformation first in small phrases. Escort remained over target becomes a common line. Multiple Mustangs on egress turns up in several reports, sometimes with an edge of disbelief. Intercept timelines lengthen, not because German aircraft slow, but because they break earlier and reform deeper in their own air. The attack profile tightens into single decisive shots, rather than the confident second and third acts that used to harvest stragglers. On the American side, the debrief sheets grow duller. Claims are modest. Confirmations take longer. What matters to the operations officer is not the scoreboard but whether the bomber boxes preserved spacing at the far end. Production schedules and rail tables, far from the noise of engines, decide whether doctrine is a phase or a baseline. If tanks of fuel reach forward, strips on time escorts depart with a margin that invites aggression. If wings and engines arrive at depots, in the numbers planned maintenance chiefs sign off on risky sorties without flinching. The long-range plan depends on that steadiness in supply. When a convoy is late or a depot short-staffed, the pilots feel it as a new caution in a voice on the radio and as an escort line that suddenly sits closer to the bombers than yesterday. The entire idea of offensive escort, of slicing into an intercept before it hardens, rests on the promise that the next day will look like today in everything that counts. Doctrine also changes how the two air forces think about egress. It used to be the German hunting ground. Now timers on American kneeboards carry outbound waypoints with confidence, and altitude blocks are reserved to sit on climbing interceptors who have launched late or rearmed fast. The old safe expectation: break a pass, dive for home, climb again, while the enemy runs out of breath, dies when the same enemy still has breath. German reports begin to mark the outbound as risky in ways it never was. Ground crews waiting for returns look up and see fighters circling their own fields with foreign engines. Within the groups, leadership builds a culture that tolerates initiative because the framework is strong enough to contain it. A young flight lead can press a chase beyond the target area if his fuel plan is sound and his wingman's ammunition is not low, because there is a scheduled rejoin and a known slice of sky reserved for the return. The same initiative, in the other service, can be ruinous: a long chase that ends in a dead-stick glide and a pilot lost to captivity, or worse. Risk appetite is not a virtue. It is a derivative of logistics. When the ground war demands a specific day for a port to be quiet, a bridge to be bent, an airfield to be choked, the air picture must be predictable. Offensive escort gives that predictability. The mission planner can assume interference with climbs at precise points. The army can assume fewer fighter bombers will reach the beaches. The system works not because any one pilot is brilliant, but because every unit can do the same hard thing again tomorrow. History likes to speak in victories and aces. The truth that governs March is less romantic. One side could afford to turn a tactic into a procedure and a procedure into a habit. The other side could not. The result is visible from a cockpit, as a small, stubborn fact: fighters that should have disappeared by the capital are still there, and fighters that should have chased to safety are breaking early. The day ends not with a speech, but with a maintenance log signed and a fuel truck empty. America fights like an assembly line: repeatable tasks, standardized tools, acceptable variants. Germany fights like a conservator: rare pieces, preserved exhibitions, scheduled with care lights dimmed to slow the fading. Over Berlin, only one of those postures can live in daylight. It breaks first in fingertips and then in briefing rooms. A pilot who has lived on the certainty that the far end belongs to him rolls into the sun and finds the air already occupied. The old script says the escort thins by the capital. The new scene opens with Silver Wings still holding altitude and breath. He makes the pass he has made 100 times, not from bravado, but from muscle memory, and the world writes a different answer across his windscreen. The radiator goes in the first inch of tracers. The nose shakes with a fatigue that feels like age, not damage. He keys the mic out of habit and hears his own voice, smaller than it used to be. When he lands, if he lands, he will call it persistent escort because reports demand nouns. In the cockpit, he names it something simpler: they did not go away. The next adjustment is behavioral, not rhetorical. Intercepts start later in the climb because the early climb has a price in fuel the unit cannot pay if there is a second act. Head-on attacks compress even more tightly to reduce time in the killing zone. When the pass does not bite, the break comes sooner and toward home. The long-tail chase that once harvested stragglers on the egress dissolves into discretion. On some days, the hard choice is made before the first contrails scramble to posture, because not scrambling is unthinkable, and then hold at altitude because spending the hour's ration will not buy a clean shot. The frequency grows practical and drab. Pride that used to tint jokes becomes the quiet that follows arithmetic. On the other side of the sky, the change is procedural, which is how doctrine announces victory. Escorts that used to orbit bombers like guardians now disappear forward in measured bites and reappear on time. The out leg has a guard the way the in leg does, and the absence of drama is itself the point. A gun camera shows nothing but a steady sight and a 3-second stitch. A debrief lists altitudes and fuel rather than adjectives. The myth dies not in a blast but in the routine continuation of work that used to end at a line on the map. Commands translate sensation into lines that can be filed. German staff documents begin to carry sentences that admit range without using the word defeat. Enemy fighters remain present over central sectors during all phases of the mission appears often enough to turn disbelief into expectation. Loss tables harden the impression with numbers. Aces are not immune to arithmetic. One does not return another, writes of an engine that ran hot and a sky full of strangers. A short remark in a unit diary says, "We could not outlast them today." A plain sentence like that measures more than fuel. It measures a habit that has come to the end of its life. There is still bite in the machine. A head-on pass that is timed with care will kill. A box that slips will bleed. But the aura that once clothed the deep end, the sense of private ownership of air, the certainty that a pilot could choose when a fight ended, thins into something like whether present or absent by chance rather than by right. An experienced German, who used to treat egress as a hunting period, now watches altimeter and fuel with the attention he once reserved for sight picture. He sees Mustangs over his own field at an altitude that feels impolite and waits in the pattern rather than inviting a duel that might strand him. A young wingman learns the new caution as if it were an old truth and cannot remember when the field belonged to them. The ground participates in the collapse. Controllers slow the cadence of vectors because the climb window is narrower. Maintenance chiefs move aircraft between strips like a man moving heirlooms from a leaky roof. Dispersal makes survival more likely and readiness worse. When bombs fall on a plant that distills fuel into hours, pilots feel the future shrink in their palms. The conversation in briefing rooms acquires new verbs: preserve, avoid, disengage. None of these words are cowardice. All of them are admissions that the sky has become expensive in ways it did not used to be. American paperwork grows boring in a way that terrifies opponents. Claims become modest and verification strict. Success is measured in formation integrity over target and rejoins made on schedule. The outward-facing directive "meet them ahead, stay through the target, sit on the exit" turns into a checklist with times and altitudes. Units learn which German fields produce the quickest climbs and adjust free hunt lanes like a locksmith shaping a key. The key fits. The door that was myth opens with a click, too soft to hear on film. A single sentence from a German debrief compresses the mood. "Wir konnten sie nicht mehr abschütteln." We could not shake them anymore. It is not a flourish and not an excuse. It is the tightest description a pilot can give for a day when his hands did nothing wrong and the geometry betrayed him. After enough days like this, officers begin to draw lines on maps that step back rather than out. The museum posture, "protect rare machines and rarer men," becomes a system. Aggression exists but under glass. Habit resists death. There are mornings when the air looks like the old year, and a clean slash through a box reminds everyone why the myth existed. The collapse is not theatrical, it is cumulative. A pattern of small, repeatable interferences compacts into a new normal. The capital that once sat beyond reach becomes a place where escorts can loiter, and loitering does something to morale that tables cannot chart. Bomber crews stop talking about the moment the horizon turns hostile. German mechanics stop promising a quick turn that leads to a second pass. The conversation shifts to preservation and to the next day's fuel truck. The last piece to fall is tone. Laughter on the German frequency, once the bravado before a roll-in, returns only in brief flashes and often after a safe landing. The escort frequency, once tight with defensive chatter, carries longer strips of silence, interrupted by tidy commands. Silence has changed sides. Over the city, the sky still bites and burns and kills, but the legend that believed distance would thin, the enemy has been buried under contrails and film cans, and the dull rhythm of procedures that work. That was the week the far end stopped belonging to anyone who counted on loneliness. After that, it was just air within reach of men who did not get tired. In the days after the first Berlin run, the proof travels faster than rumor. Film cans spool in dark rooms, clean frames show a sight held steady, and a brief stitch that turns a predator into weather. Crews pass the reels hand to hand without ceremony. The lesson is small enough to fit in a sentence and large enough to move timetables. Escorts can be present where distance used to be law. The next mission's briefing slides an outbound guard into the plan as if it had always been there. No one calls it bold. It is simply what the map requires. On German fields, the air smells of fuel that will not be enough. Mechanics trade parts between dispersal strips and write neat signatures under engines that are tired before their hours. A flight that launches for posture returns on schedule with ammunition still heavy and pride burning like frostbite. The debrief does not scold, it records. Engagements deferred due to escort presence on egress. A phrase like that looks harmless on paper. In the chest, it lands as a new gravity. The far end is no longer a place to hunt. It is a place to survive. Tempo changes in ways that felt impossible a month earlier. Bomber groups keep formation through the target and most of the way out. Gaps that once opened like wounds close into lanes. The chatter in the boxes thins to the essential because fear is not doing the talking anymore. Navigators trust the clock. Pilots hold course when the instinct to drift is strongest. Gunners watch arcs rather than ghosts. The courage required has not diminished. It has been reorganized into procedures that work often enough to be believed. On the other side of the contrails, ground control adjusts to a world that refuses to yield empty sky. Vectors shorten, climbs begin later, the line between prudence and defeat blurs. Commands that once lived by initiative now keep aces close to the fields that need their names more than their kills. When a section breaks early and lands with fuel to spare, the logic is sound and the message is corrosive. The museum posture takes shape not as policy but as habit. Preserve what cannot be replaced. Hope that tomorrow's raid takes a different lane. Wish for weather. The factories and depots write the legacy in ledgers. Replacement engines arrive on time, often enough that planners dare to promise a forward sweep every day the weather allows. Drop tanks stack in sheds like loaves. Pistons and plugs queue on benches. Training units push a thin but steady river of pilots who can hold instruments and obey checklists at altitude. None of this is glamorous. All of it is decisive. A tactic becomes a procedure when the supply truck keeps the rendezvous. There are consequences beyond the tables. German pilots who learned the old sky as a private place at day's end now hesitate to dive after a straggler because the egress hums with foreigners. Young men who were told that distance would thin the enemy take their first deep mission and find company where loneliness used to live. The new caution is not cowardice. It is an adaptation to a climate that has changed. The old jokes fade because the punchline requires an empty horizon that no longer appears. Evidence accumulates in quiet ways. A diary line. We could not finish them on the way out. A group memo. Maintain altitude block on outbound until waypoint echo. A gun camera reel. With nothing spectacular. Just the slow, certain, unraveling of a coolant line at 30,000 feet, and the long glide of a fighter that has become a glider. After enough days like this, the legend of the deep end becomes a story told about last year. What follows is a narrowing of choices. Germany can concentrate fighters around a few targets and buy a day's relief at the cost of tomorrow's flexibility, or spread thin and concede that the far end is contested. America can keep pressing the outbound guard and accept extra crash landings and bent airframes as the price of pressure, or fall back into rings and watch the old losses return. The record shows which path each side took. Two questions linger in the debrief rooms and belong to the audience as much as to the men who flew. If long-range escort had arrived 6 months earlier, would the worst days, those names that live like scars, have been shortened or changed beyond recognition? And at what point does a machine that is excellent in a duel lose to a machine that is merely good, but present again and again at the far end? The ground war is approaching a hinge. Ports and bridges and rail knots wait for a sky that keeps time. The airmen have learned that repeatable presence breaks habits more reliably than single brilliant blows. That is the legacy of the week, when Berlin stopped being a private hunt and became just another place where work could be done in daylight. Next, we drop altitude until dirt has texture and rivers have smell. The subject is the thunderbolt. The airplane ground units learn to call a flying bulldozer, and the question is simple: what happens to armored columns when the road itself begins to carry teeth?